Hello and welcome to this week's CPD, or this month's CPD. I'm Henry Dumbleton, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a project that I completed last year, developing a Category A procedure, new Category A procedure for the Sikorsky S76C++, working with flight structures and with Northland Emergency Services Trust. Today I'm just going to stick at a relatively high level, got a fair bit I want to cover. Starting with where the project came from, what the operator requirement was, then how we tackled that problem and came up with an approach to address that requirement, and then dive a wee bit into the flight testing, some of the flight test preparation activity, the flight testing itself, show a few videos, and then talk about some of the lessons learned both from this program but also from previous testing programs that I've done. So dive straight into it, talk a wee bit about Nest and the S76. They've operated the S76 for about 20 years. They love the machine. It's well suited to their operation. It's got long legs, it's fast, it's cost effective to operate. But the need is there, the machines they have, they're getting on a wee bit, and there's a need to modernise and to future-proof the operation. They did a bit of shopping around and they identified the Sikorsky S76C++ model. The C++ has got more payload, higher gross weight, more engine power, and some modernised systems. So in particular it's got electronic engine control, FADEC. And in particular with regards to this project and engine failure and that sort of side of things, then the FADEC really helps with workload and taking care of the engine management while allowing the pilot just to focus on flying the aircraft. So overall, the C++ is a really good upgrade on the A models they were operating prior. Like all EMS operators, Nest operates from a whole wide range of different areas, anywhere from beaches to car parks. Often it's confined to be surrounded by people and trees and houses, and of course they then end up often on the rooftop of a hospital, which is, again, a relatively confined area surrounded by buildings and whatever else, so not many options, not many places to land in the event of an emergency or an engine failure. So for those types of operations in New Zealand, you must operate Performance Class 1, and Performance Class 1 is basically a zero exposure philosophy. It basically means that at any point an engine failure occurring at any time, but in particular takeoff and landing, you can ensure that the occupants and the bystanders remain safe. So Performance Class 1, you can dive into the regulations and the operational requirements to chase it all through, but long story short, in New Zealand what it means is that you must operate a Category A approved helicopter in full compliance with the Category A flight manual supplement. So Category A, just for those of you who might not be aware, is a certification requirement under the FARs, in this case FAR 29, and it obviously applies to twin engine helicopters. And it basically, if in the event of an engine failure, your remaining engine will ramp up to an emergency power level to make up as much of the lost power as possible, and then the Category A flight manual contains limitations and procedures and performance which ensure that the helicopter can safely continue flight, either fly away or whether it goes down and lands. So whether you fly away or whether you go to helipad depends on where you are in your procedure relative to the decision point. So the Sikorsky the S76C++ is fully Category A approved helicopter. So no problem. Unfortunately, there is a problem, which is that the S76 was designed around 30 years ago, and the Category A procedures were targeted at the market at the time, which at that time was primarily oil and gas offshore operations, and so the approved procedures in the flight manual are largely related to offshore oil rigs, where you've got large pads high up off the ocean, and the focus for those types of procedures is to just get up, get off the pad and fly away. And if you have an engine failure, you can then drop down below the height of the helipad, use that height to build up speed, and once you've got the speed, you get the performance to fly away. Obviously, that doesn't work for operating EMS in New Zealand, and so Nest had to make a decision whether they move to a different airframe that has category A procedures which are better suited to their operation, or that can meet their operation, or to develop their own procedure. And since that I'm here, you've probably guessed that's of course that Nest chose the latter. They came to Flight Structures and turned me to help them solve this problem. So, big picture, the project involves developing a new category A procedure, demonstrating that procedure via flight test, writing it up in a flight manual supplement, and approving it via STC. The clever part of the project, which is Pete Turnbull's sort of clever idea. He looked at the existing Sikorsky procedures and went down into a real detail level and broke out the parts which could be reused for their operation and the parts that needed to be changed. And the reason that's quite a valuable approach is that he effectively came up with a way to minimize the number of changes and use as much of the existing approved data as possible, just to limit the scope of the project. So, in particular, he took an existing drop-down procedure from an oil rig and used that performance for the fly-away portion, but instead of the drop-down, he replaced that with a backup procedure. So basically taking off from ground level, climbing and backing up to that equivalent height above the ground level is what you'd have for your existing approved procedure, and then flying away from there. So what that meant is that the only new novel part that we had to introduce was to demonstrate that from that decision point that we could get back down to the pad safely, and all the other aspects regarding the performance and the flyaway were already taken care of and approved. So therefore, for this STC, our method of compliance was a mix of similarity and flight tests, and that did just really help reduce the scope. The next stage was to take that concept and take that draft procedure that Pete Turnbull had come up with and demonstrate it via flight test. So the first thing we did for that was to go to a simulator at Flight Safety in Louisiana. So they have a S76C++ simulator. It's an FAA approved level D simulator. What level D means is that it is qualified based on actual aircraft data, and to pass the level D certification, the simulator must match the aircraft data within a very tight tolerance. So the simulator is a full motion simulator. All the systems inside it are modelled, and what it allows you to do obviously is jump in, replicate the helicopter performance, and then safely develop the procedure. Our first video is a video of us, one of our first attempts in the simulator with our draft procedure. We had a guy sitting in the back who could instruct the engine failures, and we could try multiple attempts, every 5 minutes. So in the course of a couple of days, we were able to get through hundreds of simulated engine failures. And what that allowed us to do is really just knock the corners off the procedure and identify the key parameters. The most important thing that came out of the work in the simulator was it gave Nest the confidence that the procedure would work, and that allowed them to then commit to an expensive flight test program to complete the project. So let's go flight testing. What do we need for flight testing? Well, flight testing, a large part of it really is the logistical activity, getting everything, all the right equipment, the right people, and whatever in the right place at the right time. So for this flight test campaign, we needed an airfield, somewhere where we had a nice open space. We needed to do testing at night, so we had to organise our own lighting. We obviously set up all the markings to represent the helipad that we're operating from as well. We installed cameras in the helicopter, plus we had cameras on the airfield. We used GoPro cameras, which we find are performed the best with regards to the high light contrast, as well as dealing with the vibration. One thing I did differently this time, which was really good, was using the you can get a GoPro Wi-Fi remote, and you can use that to synchronize all the cameras. So when you press record, they all start recording simultaneously, and that's really simplifies when you post-process. All your videos run together, which really helps when you're trying to compare the parameters on the engine display to the events in the cockpit. We need to organise ballast, so we can use fuel to control the weight, but we need to be able to control the CG as well between the forward limit and the aft limit, depending on which aspect's critical for the particular test. To do that, we filled up sacks with gravel, 20 pound each, weighed them, and that also allowed us to compensate for fuel burn. So as we burn fuel, we just keep adding more sacks in just to maintain whatever test weight we're working to at the time. We also need some pilots. Obviously we've got Peter Turnbull, highly experienced S76 and everything else under the sun pilot, 21,000 hours in total. We employed the services of Michelle from Polaris Flight Test. He's a FAA approved Category 1 experimental test pilot. He's also experienced with Category A testing. In fact, we've worked with him before doing our BK117 Category A testing. We need nice weather for our flight test. That's a tricky one to plan for, but I guess what you have to do is make sure that your test window is large enough to give you a strong likelihood of having enough days of good weather to get the testing done that you need to do. For this testing, we had a 2-week window, and we had 2 weeks. We really had about 5 days of actual testing we needed to do. So we kind of had a 2 or 3 fold factor on top of the actual days of testing versus how much time we allocated to get the right weather. The airfield had meteorological instrumentation on it as well, which we utilised, and we needed a helicopter. So with a helicopter, obviously the key points are to understand the configuration and get the conformity for it, so you know what it is exactly you are testing, and get the weight and balance right. Now for weight and balance, for this type of testing, you're best just to go and weigh the machine. There's no, it's too important of a thing to get wrong to then find that, you know, weeks later that you've actually forgot to add something in and you've done all your testing 50 kgs lower than what your target weights were. So just stick it on the scales and get a weight. And there's a bunch of other stuff, insurance and experimental flight certificate, all maintenance support. So the point is, big picture, big part of the flight test and setting up for a successful test program is about all the logistics and all the organisation that goes in prior. And often, or usually that falls onto the project engineer or flight test engineer to kind of drive those requirements and get everything set up and ready. Of course, any one of those things can bring the whole thing down. So it's important to be thorough in that planning phase. So we find ourselves over in Canada with a helicopter and some pilots. What are we trying to achieve? Well, we've got our draft procedure. We need to develop that procedure so that it's a good, safe procedure that works for NEST operationally. We have the objective of simplifying the procedure, making it pilot friendly, because we feel that certain aspects of the Sikorsky procedure are a little bit complex and can be a little bit difficult to interpret. Obviously, we need to do the testing and collect all the evidence to support the STC approval, and then ideally we return the chopper in one piece. So, flight testing. So we've got our draft procedure. We back up to our decision point, fly away beyond that, or go back down to the pad. Now the plan there is they had to do that one procedure onto a 40-foot pad, and then NEST can use that all throughout their operation, including into helipads on top of hospital roofs. Then for landing, the plan would be just to recycle the existing Sikorsky landing procedure as it is, with no change. Unfortunately, we very quickly figured out that wasn't going to happen. When we did our backup procedure, we found that the 40-foot pad was too small. What we ended up doing is extending that 40-foot pad out to a 60-foot pad. Now 60-foot was too big for some of the helipads on hospitals that NEST operates from, so we then determined we needed to develop an additional procedure for that. So we ended up with 2 takeoff procedures. We also evaluated the existing Sikorsky landing procedure, and we found that there was room for improvement with that. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So now we've got quickly sort of figured out that instead of 1 procedure, we needed to think quickly and develop 3 procedures. So I'm going to step through those 3 procedures quite quickly, and just point out some of the more interesting points. So we started off testing, and through the initial phase of the testing, the goal was to polish and improve the draft procedure into a workable operational procedure. The early procedure was based on what we did in the test cell, rather in the simulator, and it started off with quite a steep profile. When we did the testing, we found that this actually led to quite a critical situation at the bottom, right before touchdown, where the pilot needs to time the collective input, and we found that that was quite a narrow window and was quite challenging for the pilot. So we set about trying to improve the procedure, and we changed a whole bunch of different variables, and whether we came out to the side a wee bit, come back shallower, and in the end we settled on this next the procedure shown by this next video, and this one worked really well. So the changes are quite subtle, but the change in terms of the pilot perspective and the difficulty of the procedure is really quite significant. The final procedure comes up is more shallow. The pilot uses the sight picture through the chin window to set the backup slope, then for an engine failure prior to the decision point, gets the nose down, builds a bit of speed. He's got good visibility of the pad out the front of the helicopter. He maintains the rotor RPM on the way down within a set range. That's key. The trick with this procedure is to just let the helicopter fall and just maintain that rotor RPM. It feels like you're coming down quite fast, but if you try to slow that descent, you will bleed RPM and have nothing left at the bottom. So it's a wee bit like an auto rotation. You've just got to get the collective down, maintain the RPM, and then at the bottom, with the flare and a collective pull, you've got enough energy to come onto the pad. The next video shows a pilot perspective of that. So this procedure was largely one of the most important things we found was visibility, and having the pilot maintain the focus on the helipad throughout the procedure as much as possible. We found that if the pilot is able to focus on the helipad, then they are able to accurately control the flight path back to the pad. So it comes down to a bit of a workload thing. Make sure that the pilot can manage the various tasks, but while still having enough attention on the helipad. So then that's engine failure prior to the decision point. Then if you have an engine failure after the decision point, you want to fly away. So this was pretty much as per the existing approved Sikorsky procedure. But we want to demonstrate it in the context of our backup. So the pilot gets the nose right down, builds up speed, and once you've got speed, you've got the performance to climb away. So the next procedure we did is the landing procedure. So the original plan here was just to reuse the existing Sikorsky landing profile. When we did the testing, what we found is that the profile was quite difficult to interpret. Reading through the flight manual, they define it in terms of descent rates and angles, like the approach angles, with the various sort of steps going down, and it's quite a complex procedure. And they also have a decision point at 50 feet. And what we found is that coming down through 50 feet, engine failure, by the time you allow for the pilot to recognise the failure and react to the failure, you're pretty much on the ground. The window to get the nose down and fly away and maintain sufficient ground clearance is really quite small, and we found it really difficult to replicate. So we tried a number of times to demonstrate it. In the end, we decided to rewrite the procedure, and we rewrote the procedure and simplified the instructions right down. So we replaced a lot of the words around that define the approach with a sight picture. So basically we use a picture, a pilot perspective view, looking out of the cockpit, showing where the helipad should look and what it should look like relative to the chin window. along with approach speeds. And we also raised the decision point up to 150 feet. And so when we tested our procedure, we found it just super simple and easy. The next video shows that if you, for the continued landing, coming through from an engine failure at 150 feet, the pilot is actually, it's very simple, very little for them to do. They have a very slight check down on the collective just to control the RPM decay onto the single engine, and then a flare and cushion with the collective at the bottom. So, big picture, we found that our procedure really just made it much more pilot friendly and much higher safety margins compared to the Sikorsky procedure.
Well, that one felt easy. Yep.
And the same with the bulk landing. With the extra 100 feet on the decision point, you just got a whole lot more room and margin to do it. The next procedure is the elevated takeoff procedure. This is the procedure that Nest will use when operating from hospital rooftops. And so for this procedure, we're just using the exact same procedure and performance from the Sikorsky flight manual. And all we had to change were the limitations around that procedure. The helipad size, some of the equipment and the lighting, that side of things. So the biggest change was moving the pad, changing it from a 70-foot down to a 40-foot pad. When in the profile during takeoff, you come up and the pad sort of disappears a wee bit below you. So how we dealt with that was we added new lateral reference lines coming out from the centre of the pad out to the side, and at night we have lighting requirements on those as well. And what that allows to do is the pilot can lift up on the takeoff, look out the side window and maintain position directly above the centre of the pad. And if there's an engine failure before decision point, they can drop the collective and using those reference lines just bring it straight back down to the centre. And we found it worked really well. So that got us around the helipad size reduction. From a workload point of view, it's really important that the pilot keeps his focus outside the window, outside the helicopter, to maintain the position above the pad. So we want to avoid the pilot having to look back into the cockpit to read power or height or other parameters. So one of the requirements for this procedure that we introduced was that it was mandatory to have a decision point tone. So there's a device inside the helicopter which monitors radar altitude, and at the decision point gives the pilot a tone. So then the pilot can focus outside. When he hears the tone, he inputs the collective rather than inputs the cyclic and noses over and flies away. So there are our three procedures. We did them all for day and night. We included crosswinds and we had a mix of single crew and dual crew to deal with the workload. But generally speaking, at night we found the workload was increased, and so we made those procedures minimum 2 crew. And overall, the procedures that we approved all kind of met Nest goals of meeting their limitations and requirements, but also being pilot friendly and safe. So we submitted that to the CAA and got the STC approved September 2018 last year. So overall, it was pretty good. So I'll just quickly, in the time available, just quickly whip through some lessons learned from this campaign and previous. Number one, get the right equipment and the right people. It's a false economy to skimp because the cost of testing is so high, and the cost of missing a day or two because you haven't got the right camera or the right battery or whatever else is too high. So you're best just to make sure you have everything there so you can efficiently work through your program and complete it as soon as possible. Number 2 is a bit of a joke. Number 3 is basically for the flight test engineer, it's really important to be at least one step ahead of all the testing. So you really need to know what tests you've got to do, why you've got to do them, what are the compliance requirements that are driving those tests, and you need to be on any given day up in the morning preparing all your cards, so you're fully on top of everything you're trying to achieve that day. Then go out, execute the test, and then back that night, collect all your video, fill in all your test cards, and plan for your next day to fill in all the holes that you've missed. It's really easy. The workload can go quite high, especially if you've got consecutive days of testing, and it could be easy to get overwhelmed and then potentially miss test points or miss requirements, cert requirements. And if you discover that weeks later, when you're back home in the office, then that could have pretty serious. So you really need to be really good planning and one step ahead. Thorough briefings are pretty obvious. What I do like to do is make sure that as well as doing the actual specific test objectives in the briefing, that everyone knows why we're doing those tests and the requirements that are driving it, so that when the pilots are executing it, that they're respecting the intent of the rule as much as the actual what's written on the flight test schedule. The other key thing is you can find that once you very quickly find yourself out in the helicopter making a lot of noise and things start happening quite quickly. So you really need to have some plans in place for how you're going to deal with certain situations. One of the key ones we had was a phrase, recover, recover, recover. And that was any one of the 3 crew on the helicopter could say recover, recover, recover. And at that point, co-pilot and the pilot had a pre-planned recovery procedure. And it sort of means that you end up with 3 eyes looking out to look for any possible issues. And we used it quite a bit. So for example, you might notice that the wind directions shifted, so you can kick in then. Next one is incremental weight build-up. So the key point here is that it's non-linear, the relationship between weight and difficulty. And you can sort of get stuck in with your lightweight thinking, oh, this is already easy, everything's kind of going along really nicely. And it's that last 50 kgs that gets you. So you've got to be really careful that you don't fall off that cliff. Similar sort of story with wind. It's kind of a really non-linear sort of thing that testing with 5 knots is really, really easy, and you get a false impression of how easy everything is. And then if you get minus a few knots, suddenly the whole thing gets very hard very quick. So you really need to be testing in that 0 to 3 knots with regards to this performance category A height velocity testing near the ground. Quick note on workload is make sure that you consider all the different conditions for which your procedure is approved when you're considering your workload. So you're considering your crosswind, your traffic, your night and your day, and all the different tasks that the pilot's going to have to perform in real life. So again, we found that it was okay for a single pilot in daytime, but at night time the workload went up for him, and so we needed to have a second crew member in there. Number 7 is make hay while the sun shines. So we had a 2-week test window and we lost pretty much the entire second week to fog. So we only got through the testing because we were prepared and we made really good progress early on. Quick note on hazards, just to consider the big picture of hazards. So you're obviously going to work through all your core hazards related to your core activity. But in reality, one of the biggest hazards we had was these big 200-foot trees. Number 9, expect to find problems and don't avoid solving them. So during testing, you will often find that there's issues present themselves, and it can be quite tempting to that if you've got time pressure or project pressure, to look for ways to avoid them. But what I recommend is you really take those on as opportunities to improve the procedure and improve the safety. So in this testing, we found that tail boom clearance was an issue, and we knew that was going to be an issue because Sikorsky had talked to us about that themselves during their testing. And as this video shows, we made contact with the tail boom during one of our tests. It was just a light touch, and it just caused superficial damage to the cowling. But we took that lesson and we decided to incorporate a new limitation on the aft CG at maximum weight. And the result of that was giving a really good improvement in tail boom clearance, and it also just made the overall procedure in terms of visibility and flare authority, just made the whole thing much better. So we decided to incorporate that as a limitation and take on that lesson from the touching the tail. Last point is don't miss the opportunity to communicate to the operational pilots. So through this testing, we obviously built a lot of knowledge about the helicopter and how it performs in this procedure and all the critical parameters and what works and what doesn't work. we took that knowledge and we used it as best we could to try to describe the procedures in the flight manual using pictures and diagrams, but also expanding the training info in the back of the flight manual to really talk about all the things that we figured out in terms of wind and in terms of rudder RPM and pilot techniques, and including pictures of us doing the tests so they can see what they're trying to achieve. And that's it. So that was the project. It was a really good project, and personally I really enjoyed working on it. It was really interesting. It was really good working with the CAA on this project. They were really pragmatic and receptive to ideas. We had lots of robust discussions the whole way through the project, so there were no big surprises at the end. We sort of worked together and we knew what we were all doing. And a big thanks to Nest, and in particular Pete Turnbull. It was really great customer, really knowledgeable, really engaged with the project and the requirements and what we were doing and why, and a real emphasis on getting it done right. They really had a good attitude towards the whole thing, so that made the whole thing a real pleasure. So that's my presentation. Thanks very much for listening. Unfortunately, because this is pre-recorded, I can't take your questions. If I can figure out a way to get those in somehow later, we can do that. But if you do have questions, feel free to call me or email me. I've got my details here on the screen. Yeah, that'd be cool. If you've got any questions, just feel free to fire them through, and we can I can email them back, and maybe I can get Sean to distribute that to the wider group as well. So once again, thanks very much, and I'll see you later. Cheers.